but what does your day-to-day actions really look like? What does that role entail?
Well, I will let you guys know that during the pandemic, from now on, this will be my fun fact, I actually started a new job. I transitioned from Ironwood Pharmaceuticals just 2 weeks ago to Amylyx Pharmaceuticals, AMYLYX. And Amylyx Pharmaceuticals is developing drugs for neurodegenerative diseases. So currently, we just completed a trial and announced top-line results at the end of last year for ALS. And we're working with the FDA to try to file a new drug application for an ALS indication, so based on our phase 2 results. So I have a similar role. So I am a global head of medical affairs. And day to day, it's an interesting, because if you'd asked me before the pandemic started versus today, it's similar, but not the same, right? So I'm having a lot of meetings just like this. So the month of March, I don't know how you guys felt about it, but it was really exhausting, and it was really hard to get used to meeting like this and really feeling like you were being productive and connecting with people. But that's definitely gotten easier as we've used that muscle more. So my typical day in a new job is just learning all of the people that I'm working with and learning a new disease state. So it's very interesting. When I did my PhD, in pulmonary arterial hypertension with Dr. Mark Gillespie, who's now at the University of South Alabama. And then I went on to do a postdoc at UAB, focusing more on lung disease, on acute respiratory distress syndrome and the role of free radicals in that disease state. And then when I was an assistant professor at Texas Tech, I went back to more vascular biology and had a grant for looking at why fenfluramine causes damage and can lead to pulmonary hypertension, and went back to sort of cellular biology that way. But so then when I joined industry, my first industry job was in cardiovascular as well. So looking at actually type 2 diabetes, metabolism, cardiovascular, hypertension, dyslipidemia. And then I spent the last 8 years in GI diseases, specifically in highly symptomatic GI diseases that are not organic. They're mediated by visceral hypersensitivity. So it's the talk between the gut and the brain. And now I'm switching to ALS. So in all of those roles, the foundation of what drives my daily activities is really being steeped in the science, the disease state, the pathophysiology, the pharmacology, understanding the treatment paradigms, understanding how physicians and treaters are looking at treating patients, and especially understanding the patient and the journey that the patient takes from first understanding that they have a symptom or that they have a problem, and then being diagnosed, and then what their treatment path is. So that's what grounds me every day is learning and understanding the complexities and how all of those different pieces play in together. So my background as a pharmacist, but also as a basic scientist and a clinician, I practiced pharmacy for about 10 years off and on, part-time, putting myself through the programs that you guys are in. It kind of blends together for me. But it really all starts as a baseline of really understanding all of that data, all of that information, and translating the basic science and the clinical data into what really happens for a patient at the end of the day and how they're treated.
So those are a lot of disease states that you have worked with and in. We often hear differing opinions on like after your PhD, whether you should stick in your disease state or whether you should switch to something completely different. Mm-hmm. What have your experiences been like switching from one to the next?
It's interesting because I'm really happy to be talking to you guys about this, because I think I've been in your shoes and I know what it felt like to be thinking, okay, I'm going to go do a postdoc. How do I choose? And I relied very heavily on my PhD mentor, which was the right thing to do. To be honest, I wish I could tell you that I, sat down and created this plan to move forward and how to move, do this and do that. Looking back, it all seemed pretty accidental, but it all worked out. So don't get too wrapped up in, oh my God, this is going to be a major move and I'm, not going to benefit from it. You're going to learn new things. So don't feel like you have to put so much pressure on yourself to make the perfect move for your next step, whatever that is going to be. But I think if you look at really understanding what your strengths are and where you can make the biggest contribution, And if there is a specific, for example, if you're really, really steeped in, molecular biology, for example, and you are not as, physiology is something that you haven't studied as much, or a functional piece, thinking about rounding out your experiences and your abilities so that you, if whatever you're pursuing, so that you have a diversity of skills and you're not just a one-track person that gets stuck. So you also have to think about diversifying so that you don't get stuck as a postdoc and just being the person who runs all the molecular biology studies, right? Because you want to be able to translate what you're doing and collaborate with other people. That's another thing. If you go to do a postdoc, make sure that you take advantage of all the other postdocs that you're working with and try to get involved in as many projects as possible, lending your skills and what you know and learning from other postdocs and what techniques that they know, for example.
We have a question from Caitlin, just in the chat box. So for industry positions such as chemistry, do you recommend doing a postdoc or just going straight into industry?
Most of the people that I know, because I moved from, I was based in the field. So my trajectory was Kentucky, Alabama, Texas. And then my first industry job was as a medical science liaison. So I was based only in the field for the first 12 years of my career. And then I moved to Boston about 8 years ago and started with Ironwood Pharmaceuticals. And they had a full chemistry lab, organic chemistry, pharmaceutical development, everything. And so I got to know a lot of the basic scientists there. And the vast majority of them, I don't even know if I know one of them who did a postdoc. Maybe one or two of them did a postdoc, but most of them came right out of their PhD program into an entry-level chemistry or pharmacology or pharmaceutical development role. So you probably could network with some people like that. You'd be surprised that if you go on LinkedIn and if you have a specific interest and I can connect you with somebody that I know, I'm happy to do that as well. But I think most people who do that don't. They go straight into industry as an entry-level position.
So what does your current team consist of? Who are the people that you directly oversee?
So it's I'm building a new team, so I don't have anybody reporting to me right now, but it will look similar, so I can tell you about my previous team. Most of my team have PharmDs or PhDs, and the team that I had previously was very diverse. There was a PhD in statistics, a PhD in nutrition, a PharmD. In the past, I've had PhDs in epidemiology, in pharmacology, in physiology, any scientific background for most of the teams that I have managed. And but they all have one thing in common in that they are really interested in communicating. So the role that I play in companies that I work for in medical affairs, I'm a bridge from our team is a bridge from the company to the medical community and the scientific community. And it has two lanes. There's information that we send out to physicians, to basic scientists, and tell them about what we're working on, the mechanism of action, the science that we're conducting, the clinical studies that are going on. And then we listen to them and listen to their ideas about, first of all, their reactions to the data that we're generating or have generated, but even more importantly to, wow, I have an idea, can we collaborate? So I've helped facilitate collaborations not only with clinical investigators, but in my previous work with PhD investigators as well, doing basic science, because as I mentioned, it was really working in visceral hypersensitivity, and there's so much unknown about how the sensations in your gut are translated to the brain and then back down, and it results in abdominal pain and bloating and discomfort. And so we worked with great investigators around the world, in Australia and in the US and in Europe, to help really tease out those mechanisms. And so my team, based in the field primarily, would interact with those individuals and bring those ideas back to the organization and then generate lots of great data and publications and a better understanding of how the drug works. So
you were doing basic science at one point as an assistant professor.
Yeah.
What caused that switch from academia to industry?
I was a great grant writer, but a terrible bench scientist. I broke all the glassware, I contaminated and back in the day, we didn't have kits to do, molecular biology and things like that. We had to, watch out for RNAs and do all of these things. But I was a terrible bench scientist. Luckily, my strength is communication. And it took me a while to figure that out. I really did enjoy the teaching part, and I actually enjoyed the grant writing part, but I didn't enjoy the actually doing the experiments. And for me, I set out my goal to be an assistant professor in the School of Pharmacy, and I was very fortunate in the timing because I graduated in 1996 with my PhD, and around that time, for the year 2000, there were a number of brand new pharmacy schools that were being built because there was there weren't enough pharmacists in the country. And so I benefited because I was around at that time doing a postdoc, and one of my classmates, David Allen, actually was on faculty at this brand new school of pharmacy. And he called me and said, would you be interested? And I said, yeah, I don't want to be a postdoc forever. I definitely want to accelerate and move to do that. So it was a risk to do that because it's a non-established, university. I had a lab, but not an animal facility in the building. So it wasn't really easy to do the research. I did get funding to set up the lab. I did get an American Lung Grant, an American Heart Grant pretty quickly. But I just realized that I've reached this dream, and I loved teaching, and I won teaching awards, and I just recognized that I'm stronger at communicating than I am at actually generating the science. And I also recognized that for me, the academic setting and the way decisions were made and the way people interacted just wasn't a good fit for me. So I started exploring what else could I do, both with my background and my degree and what I think I'm pretty good at, and how can I make a difference? For me, always it was about learning and science and ultimately contributing to medical care of patients. And so I just happened to hear about a role called medical science liaison from a fellow teacher, and we ended up taking the job as a medical science liaison at a new company. So I went with him, and I was there for 12 years. So, and as soon as I started that job, I realized it was perfect for me because I was learning every day, and that's really important to me, and it's probably a grounding for a lot of you as scientists as well. But I was also being able to use that learning and that science to communicate specifically about a therapeutic area, about a drug. And then I got to go and interact a lot with a lot of different people every day, going to academic centers and talking with clinical investigators and basic science investigators, educating them about the mechanisms of actions and disease states, and understanding their perspective on it as well. And then also had a role in going and speaking with managed care organizations to tell them about the data so that they can make good decisions for the lives of people that their managed care organizations cover.
So I've heard communication a lot. What are some other skills that are needed to strive?
I think it depends on what you want to do in industry. For medical affairs, for my role, it is communication, relationships, really being able to authentically represent what sometimes is seen as, oh, you're with industry, you must have an agenda, and it must be that you want to make everybody be on your medicine and not acknowledge the science. So it's very important as a scientist in industry, particularly in the role that I have, to maintain credibility and to not come across as being biased. And to be able to balance that with individuals in the commercial side of the organization who are incentivized in a very different way and just naturally come to selling and wanting everyone to be on their drug, and just being able to help them realize. I spend a lot of time with my commercial colleagues, with legal colleagues, with compliance, and making sure that as an organization, we are being fair and balanced in the way we put our information out into the world. And that, however, that we are also making sure that there is a deep understanding of our drugs and our viewpoint of how the clinical data is interpreted. But so communication, integrity, being able to build relationships are all very important.
So how have you seen the field really evolve over time?
From the perspective of the pharmaceutical industry, there's been a tremendous evolution in the last 20 years because the FDA, the federal government recognized that back in the 80s and 90s, quote unquote, white coat marketing started happening. And the commercial colleagues that I talked about started hiring people with PhDs and PharmDs and MDs to come and sell their products and to do the role that I'm doing now, but to do it in, to be honest with you, in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, a pretty biased way. And the federal government got involved in and you may have heard of a large settlements, like $30 million, $1 billion in some cases. There have been many, probably more than 50 settlements in the last 20 years of really calling pharmaceutical companies to task on not creating a bias in the way they're communicating about their products. So that's been the major change in the 20 years that I've been in the industry. And I think it's a great change because I think it creates more credibility about the way science is communicated. And I feel much, much better about it.
Yeah, I mean, Purdue Pharma is kind of the poster child for
yes.
white coat marketing, I guess.
They definitely are. They're definitely the black sheep.
What do you feel has been the biggest obstacle or challenge for you since you've graduated?
Probably, first of all, figuring out the struggle that I had leaving academia, right? And many of you may also encounter that as well, because you may not all stay in academia. And to be honest, there's a lot of pressure to stay in academia because that's what academic institutions train people for, right? You're trained to be the professors and to generate the science. And so being able to come to grips personally with the fact that, hey, this just isn't for me, and I'm going to be able to take the degree that I earned and the experiences that I have and make a difference in the world, but it's just going to be in a different way than my fellow academics did. So that was, and I was pretty young. I was 35 when I made that choice. So that was not an easy choice, but it was one that it came to me, especially after spending 2 years as an assistant professor and realizing, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. And the world's changed even more since then, but the funding is even harder to get than it was. And, just kind of running on that hamster wheel wasn't something that I was looking forward to, even though, like I said, I got grants pretty quickly, but just the ability to really do the things that made me the happiest and choosing the types of political environments I wanted to be in ended up being a good choice for me.
Yeah, we've seen so many studies now that we're pumping out PhDs at a fantastic rate, but those ivory tower academia positions are not growing at all.
Aren't they contracting?
Most likely, yeah.
Yeah. Unless you're in viral research right now for epidemiology. So I think COVID-19 will make some people's careers.
I can imagine.
Yeah, anything you can do to skew your research to COVID-19 right now, you might get funding. I know a lot of people, I've talked to friends of mine who are still in academia who are definitely doing that. They're thinking, wow, can the model I have help in figuring this out? So there's opportunity.
Yeah, our college itself is putting together a couple of projects based on COVID.
Great.
Especially with respect to antibody testing.
Nice.
So in that switch from academia to industry, what do you think prepared you the most for being able to make that switch?
I think my grounding in scientific training and rigor and credibility from being a scientist perspective was really what prepared me, because when I was going into an uncertain environment and not knowing the pharmaceutical business, or certainly not the research side, being able to go back to my grounding and my roots as a scientist and train rigorously was what really helped me stay true to who I am and what my roots are, but also being able to immediately make an impact and contribute.
And how has, throughout the various stages and the multiple companies that you've been at, how has your work-life balance changed?
It's changed a lot because for 12 years, I was, like I said, based in the field. And I happened to love to travel, which was a good thing because I traveled usually every week I would leave on Monday night or Tuesday morning and come back on Thursday night or Friday morning. And that worked really well for me. And then I'd be home on the weekends. The work that I do also requires weekend travel, going to congresses like the Digestive Disease Week or the American College of Gastroenterology meetings, like the American Academy of Neurology is a meeting that I would go to if it weren't for COVID-19 just last week. But so there was a lot of travel, which I loved. And yeah, I think work-life balance is a struggle for everyone, especially people who have families. When I switched to headquarters, then I had to really transition from being very independent, traveling most of the time, to going to an office every day. And that was a big adjustment for me. And not so much a work-life balance, but just a way of working change. I will say this, that I did realize, it probably took me 2 or 3 years into my career to realize that there's no organization, whether it's an academic organization or a pharmaceutical company or a pharmacy or anything, that is going to value you as much as you value yourself. And so I learned to work really smart and not work as hard or as long in terms of hours. And that realization, it took me a few years to realize that. And I realized, look, the more I put into it, it doesn't mean that I'm going to get more out of it. So I chose really what I learned to do is to figure out what is the highest priority and the biggest contribution that I can make. And I'm going to focus there, and I'll let the other little things go.
And have you seen that shift within the field itself, especially when we talk more about wellness and mental health?
Not necessarily.
No.
No, I think it's an individual. I don't think it's not an organizational shift. Individuals make that shift themselves. And I've mentored a lot of people around that as well, because some people will drive themselves crazy because they're always running behind. They're always trying to play catch up. And I think some of that is just learning to prioritize and understand your own style of work, and adjusting and negotiating for the style of work that works best for you. But you have to understand yourself first before you can apply that.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Anything that I haven't touched on that you guys would like to ask?
There's a chat question, Rupinder.
From Kaylin, is a role more centered around communication? Wait. Okay, is a role more centered around communication, how someone like an epidemiologist or statistician would best fit into a team like yours?
Actually, I don't have statisticians or epidemiologists on my team currently, or haven't in a long time. They're primarily PhDs in hard science, pharmacology, physiology. I did have one statistician, but he's a little bit of an anomaly. One nutrition PhD. The vast majority of the PhDs that I've had have been physiology, chemistry, biochemistry, pharmacology. It's not to say that a statistician or epidemiologist wouldn't fit. It just they would have to flex. All of them have to flex the way they think and come at it as a non-specialist, because you really have to think across. And you have, what we really do is translate. It's a translational role. So you have to think from basic science to clinical science, even to health economics and outcomes research as well.
And with your team, is everybody essentially doing the same job of translating that translation, or do you have like somebody's handling the written material, somebody's handling graphics? Do you have any breakdowns like that?
They're not broken down exactly like that. They're broken down a little bit differently. So our field-based people, the medical science liaisons, are more about interacting with our opinion leaders, we call them, or the experts in the field. And they are using the materials that are generated, the slide decks, et cetera, by someone based in headquarters who's a strategist. And they're the primary person who is sitting and looking at all of the data, asking questions, identifying gaps in the data, doing that translation. And then they'll work with the MSL team to refine it, but the MSLs are really execution oriented. And then I always have someone in headquarters who is interacting with the scientists and the clinicians and really being the responsible along with myself to be the translator.
And as a PhD student, what kind of preparation do you recommend us to do / study for our PhD so we can be best ready to work in organizations such as yours and those that are conducting clinical trials?
Yeah, I don't know that it's necessarily about something that you would study. It's all about you're getting job opportunities where you actually do hands-on. So for example, if you were interested in clinical trials, there are a number of people with PhDs who are clinical trial research associates. So if you look at a big clinical trial contract research organization, Optum has an arm of that, or I can't remember the big one off the top of my head. But if you look at one of those big contract research organizations, or even small boutique ones, they all have clinical research associates who go out and monitor clinical trials. If you're interested in clinical trials, that's a great way to get entry into that world. And then you can work your way up in that organization and then eventually cross over to a pharmaceutical organization who has clinical operations people who are responsible for clinical trials. So that's an example. So if you identify a job that's interesting to you or a role that's interesting to you, it's not something necessarily that you can study in your PhD program unless you find a professor who's conducting a clinical trial and you get involved in helping with that clinical trial, for example. I think something more important is that you take the time, and this is not necessarily, this wouldn't be offered very unlikely in a class, but really take the time to know yourself. And by that, I mean doing Myers-Briggs assessments. There's a book called, it's based on StrengthsFinder. That's a really powerful tool to know yourself, know what drives you, know what you don't like to do, know what your strengths are, what you're really good at, understand your personality and how you interact with people, develop your emotional intelligence, because that's going to set you apart from the other individuals who may have the same background as you who are competing for different roles in organizations.
How much freedom do you have on the particular disease state you work with? I know you switched from like gut to brain access to now ASL, but were those like particularly assigned to you, or did you choose them yourself?
Well, when I switched from company to company, I chose to move to a company that was working on ALS. So it all depends on the organization. When I'm considering an organization to work for, and I recently moved, but I also have in the last few years talked to many organizations about different roles. For example, in aging, in fertility, in with diabetic nephropathy. So it's all about evaluating the organization and then saying, is this a disease state that I would be interested in working in? For example, I today wouldn't necessarily go back to hypertension. If a company came to me and said, we've got this great drug for hypertension, it really better cure hypertension or be really, really compelling, because the market is completely saturated with generic drugs that work very well in combination to control blood pressure. So that wouldn't be that appealing to me unless it was something very, very innovative and was going to bring value that was above and beyond anything that's on the market. So that's what I look for, is where this product is going to make a big, big impact in this disease state and make a difference in people's lives that's really meaningful. So each person gets to decide, though, in industry, that's the first thing you look at is, okay, there's this organization, what's their disease state? And then what is the product, what products do they have for that disease state? And is that appealing? So yeah, so you get to choose, but you choose to move companies when you do that typically. I will say also, though, my previous company, Ironwood, I not only worked in GI, we also had a separate research platform in soluble guanylate cyclase, and we were looking at refractory hypertension, sickle cell disease, diabetic nephropathy, preserved ejection fraction heart failure. So there were a number of opportunities for me to work in those different disease states as well that I didn't choose, but the company decided to go in that direction, and so I helped support that.
From Julia Schultz, who is a PharmD and currently working on her PhD. Are there any positions in industry where PharmDs and PhDs are particularly helpful, or any type of positions where they're uniquely qualified?
There are many, many. In fact, there's no limit to how PharmDs and PhDs could contribute in industry. There are PharmDs and PhDs in commercial, in regulatory, in legal, in medical affairs, in clinical affairs, in basic science, in chemistry, in organic chemistry. It just all depends on what your strengths are, what you're interested in, and what you pursue. And some of the early experiences that you get help to mold kind of what you can jump to. But there are a myriad of essentially every department is there. I've known PhDs and PharmDs to be.
And then can you talk a little bit more about what kind of, about the neurodegenerative diseases related to your work? Is it just ALS, or are there other related that you're also working on?
Yes, so the company that I currently work for, Amylyx, we've just completed a phase 2 trial last year in ALS, which you guys may be aware is a very serious neurodegenerative disease that's fatal. There's no cure. There are a couple of therapies that are used, and there's a lot of research going on in that area for gene therapy, for example, but only 10% is genetic, familial, and the 90% is just sporadic. So there aren't a lot of drugs available. The drug that Amylyx is currently developing for ALS really works on the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria for protein folding and energy processing. And we're also studying that currently in a phase 2 trial in Alzheimer's disease, which is also another really serious neurodegenerative disease. So it's a non-specific to disease state mechanism. It really could be looked at in any number of CNS diseases because it really targets accelerants of neuronal death.
If you could go back and change one thing about your career trajectory, or focus on one thing a little more, what change would you make?
I would get an MD PhD. And the reason I would get an MD PhD is because in industry, that is a currency. And physicians in industry in particular, even without a PhD, just an MD degree in industry, immediately get accelerated into upper level roles because there is a requirement for a physician to sign off on the clinical trial package for NDA, and certainly for the safety component of an NDA and in clinical trials, which is the critical piece, really, from testing in humans. So because of that, because there's a requirement for an MD, my experience has been that they get a pass to upper levels much quicker than someone with a PhD or a PharmD. And it's a career accelerant in industry specifically. And I think that applies to academia too.
What's a question I should be asking you that I'm not?
That's a good question. You should be asking me how you really get to know yourself and become self-aware.
So you mentioned the Myers-Briggs and the Gallup Clifton Strength Finder, both of which we do in our graduate program and in our PharmD program. We have a student success, I forget Nicole's exact title, but she really pioneers these assessments for us. Are there others you would recommend or other strategies?
Yeah, I think really understanding emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman wrote a great book on emotional intelligence, and understanding how that, and taking all of those things. I was really impressed that you guys have a focus on some of these softer skills, which I think is really critical. But you also read about emotional intelligence and how to package that into your thinking about it as well. And really that involves self-awareness and then agency and how you're interacting with others.
You said that you mentor a lot of people right now. How does that relationship work for you?
So a lot of times in my current role, there are only 17 of us in the organization, and I've only been there a couple of weeks, so I'm not mentoring anybody there, but I mentored a number of people in my previous role at Ironwood, and then people outside the organization as well. I also just went through a program and got my graduate certificate in executive coaching, because I had an executive coach a few years ago, and I was just so inspired by the change that she was able to help me make, and the ways of thinking about it, that I went through the program, which was really rewarding. But I also use it in mentoring as well. And so sometimes it's informal mentoring and it happens spontaneously in the moment. For example, I might see someone in a meeting and think, oh wow, if they said this, or maybe they could use this technique to talk to this person. I'll pull them aside and say, hey, did you think about this or this or this? Some of it is because of my role as a vice president, especially as a woman, where in our industry, there aren't as many women who are at the senior director level or above. Many, especially younger women, look to me or will come to me for advice, or they'll even tell me, especially as I was transitioning, oh, wow, you were a great mentor to me. And I thought, wow, we didn't formally do any kind of mentoring. It just happened spontaneously. So that's primarily how it happened. There were occasions when someone would come and say, hey, will you mentor me? And I would happily do that on their terms, however often they wanted to meet. My own team, people who reported to me, I had a very different responsibility in my estimation, not only to be a manager for them, but also to mentor them when the moments arose. And I always, for each of my direct reports, not only had their goals for the year and help them track every quarter, like how they're attaining their goals, but especially have a development plan for them, and a development plan that involved something that wasn't specific to what they did every day, but that could either help them do their job better, or help increase their job satisfaction, or help them get ready for their next role. So if people were, for example, not as confident in meetings or speaking up, I would work with them and we would practice even doing role play. Or I would observe them in a meeting, and we agreed ahead of time, I'm going to observe you, and then you're going to tell me how you think you did, and then I'll give you feedback on how I think you did. So those are some examples.
What exactly is an executive coach?
An executive coach is an individual, it's highly variable. You don't have to have any certification. You could just decide, I'm going to be an executive coach. But an executive coach is different from a life coach, and different from a mentor, and different from a boss, because the executive coach works independently with an individual. They sometimes are, and often in big corporations, are hired by the corporation, but they are responsible for helping an individual really understand who they are and how they show up in the workplace, and identify goals that they want to work on. And what happens between the coach and their coachee is very private and confidential. And you actually contract that with, as a coach, I would contract with a person to say, here's my role, here's who I will tell and who I won't tell what we talk about. Let me help you identify what your goals are. If your goal is to, really handle difficult conversations better, or if your goal is to increase your presence, your executive presence, and how you show up. And then I would help them do assessments like the Strengths Finders or Myers-Briggs, or there are a number of other assessments that executive coaches use as well. And then very often do a 360. So going to their peers, their boss, their direct reports, asking them questions and saying, how does this person show up? What could they do to improve? What do you love about working with them? And then giving that feedback, packaging it to the person, the coachee, and having them reflect on that, and then refining goals and checking in with them, usually on a monthly basis, sometimes every 2 weeks. It is a very defined relationship, usually 6 to 8 months, that has a definite beginning and a definite end. And so it's different from being a mentor, and very different from being a boss.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions from anybody? What impresses you most about the people you work with, and what do you admire about your role models?
So what I'm most impressed with about the people that especially the ones I currently work with in this new organization, which is part of the reason that I made this move, is their absolute dedication to ALS patients and Alzheimer's patients, but especially right now, ALS patients, and that every decision in the organization, whether to do a clinical trial or to do a compassionate use program where patients who are not in a trial but it's not on the market can get the drug, as part of an IND, even to the point of when are we going to commercialize, how are we going to talk to the FDA, it all revolves around how are we most going to help those patients. And I think that is not often something that the general public sees about pharmaceutical organizations. But the 3 organizations that I've worked for so far, patients, especially Ironwood and Amylyx now, there's a tremendous amount of conversations about patients and a lot of interviewing of patients and trying to understand patients and understand their journey through their disease progression. So there's one thing I wish the general public could know is how much focus there is on patients in pharmaceutical industries.
Well, with that, I'll let everybody else go. If you could hang on for one more second, I'd really appreciate it.
Of course.
But thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you being here and giving us your insight.
It was my pleasure.
So this was our first one, which thank you so much for being our first. Do you have any feedback for me or any of us as to how we could improve? Anything that I missed that I shouldn't have, any mistakes I made that I could avoid?
I didn't really notice any mistakes. I thought you did a really nice job of facilitating it, and you sent me questions in advance. I don't know, it might have been helpful for you to have my CV so people could see what an industry CV, and I'm happy to provide that now, so people could see what an industry CV looks like, because it's a bit different than what you see in academia from your professors and your own building. But I think that was probably my only piece of advice. I thought it went really well.
I'd agree. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I'll email you about the CV, and we would love to take a look at it.
All right, that's great. And also, one thing that there was someone who got a PhD, and he contacted me a few years ago, and from the medical school pharmacology group. And I think they have I don't know if it's the whole medical school PhD program or if it's just pharmacology, but his name is Kai Zhang. I don't know if you guys know him, but he had contacted me a few years ago. He's actually going to have me come and give a talk for their group. But you guys being able to connect with that group might be really helpful, because I think you're looking for some of the same things and same advice. And so I don't know if you guys are aware of them.
I'll definitely look into him.
Yeah, well, he's now here in Boston. He actually got a role at a project manager role, but he and I talked a lot. He asked me some of these same questions that you guys asked me, but he did it individually, and he was going to have me come and speak with that group. But I think if you guys join forces with that other graduate student group, you could combine and really learn from each other and what each person is learning. And I also think that Kai would be very open to you guys contacting him as well. He's a very recent example of someone, I think his PhD is in pharmacology, and he's not a pharmacist, so he's pure PhD, who did exactly move from his graduate program to a role in the industry. And he might be someone really good to have a contact with. So I'll give you his contact information. I may just take a picture of his card and send it to you.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, because I think he could be a really good connection for you.
All right. Does anybody have anything else?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much, Machelle. You were a great kickoff to this coffee conversation series. And obviously, Rupinder did a great job interviewing you, but you were fantastic. So thank you again.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thanks so much. It was my pleasure. And let me know any other way I can help.
Well, I appreciate it.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.